So let me switch to English now. Our next guest has traveled from Schaffhausen, Switzerland, but is originally, I think, born, raised, and definitely educated in Arkansas, in the USA. And now if you're thinking, you're probably starting to think, Arkansas, where is that exactly? It's definitely in the south of the USA somewhere. There must be the Mississippi to the east, right? There's Memphis somewhere.
And go down just a little bit.
Then go down a little bit, yeah. I think there's Missouri in the north. There's Oklahoma to the west. There's probably Louisiana to the south, but if you want to know that for sure, and if you want to place in this great state of Arkansas, you probably have to rely on a device, right? And some kind of technology, and a lot of that technology is actually made by the company that our next guest is working for. Garmin builds devices that help you locate and navigate more properly than I just did pretty much out of the top of my head. Garmin is a company that is located primarily in Kansas, but also in Schaffhausen here in Europe, which is at the Bodensee in Switzerland, and in Southampton in England. It's just to give you a general idea of how large Garmin is. I think there was $5 billion revenue last year, actually, so we're talking big numbers here. Many different devices, be they for aviatic reason, for nautical reasons, but also for their fitness wearables we've been talking about now for just about an hour. So our guest has studied law, computer science, and math, as I remember, in Arkansas also. And she's been with Garmin for the company for quite some time, since 2008, actually, in Kansas, where you did consumer engineering. She then switched to the legal department in 2014. And in 2017, she became Garmin's EU DPO. EU for Europe, of course, and DPO is the Data Protection Officer. DPO for the Data Protection Officer, first in Munich, and then in Schaffhausen. She's also the DPO for two sister companies affiliated with Garmin called Navionics in Italy and Firstbeat in Finland. Garmin Würzburg in this country is part of the IniviDas project to increase digital autonomy. So the topic for today, of our talk, is privacy by design and by default in practice. Please welcome, very pleased you made it, Becky Caldwell.
Thanks. Thank you, everybody, and thank you for accommodating English. I promise you, you do not want to hear my German. It is not very good. I am trying, but it's difficult. So today we're talking about wearables. As Toby mentioned, our company does more than just wearables, so I have a very interesting job on the privacy side because, of course, there's wearables, then there's the marine products, aviation, all sorts of stuff, so I enjoy it very much. But today I'm going to focus on the wearables because that's what we're here for. And we're going to have a lot of academic and ethical discussions through the day. I do intend to talk a little bit about that stuff, but I'm also going to talk about how we put these things in practice and give you the best example I have, which obviously is what I'm entrenched in, is Garmin's program. So I'll give you some examples from that and kind of show you how these can be taken from these words on paper and actually put into action, because I think it's a powerful illustration. So, oops. Aha, OK. Sorry, I didn't know if it actually went to the next thing. So Toby already gave me a great introduction, went through kind of the history there. I have had a unique career path. When I was in consumer engineering, I was a software engineer. I was working on server operations, so care and feeding of servers is what I used to call it. And so I would do troubleshooting, on-call development, and deployments. So lots of fun. I did go to law school, and so the legal team lured me in to do patent and copyright stuff, and then I moved into data protection, which is really my niche. It's where I belong because I can use the technical skills and the legal skills and just get involved with everything, so I love it. So what is privacy by design and by default? So my notes are gone. So we're going to talk about that today. It's only a portion, obviously, of all the obligations under the law and things like that, but I think it's an important part of the discussion around digital autonomy and ethics, because this is how you actually make sure that you're building something that does respect privacy. So brief history, it's privacy by design is kind of a semi-new concept. Privacy itself is not. I mean, over 2,000 years ago, Aristotle talked about the difference between the public and private spheres of life. Since then, there have been lots of cases, laws, things going on that have evolved it, and principles by the OECD in 1980 to kind of have these core common themes among data protection. And so the first modern data protection law, of course, was in the 70s in Sweden, and countries have followed suit since then. So that's privacy, but privacy by design privacy by design has been talked about mostly since the 90s, and it was Dr. Anne Kavukin, I can't remember how to pronounce it. She was the Deputy Privacy Commissioner in Ontario, Canada, and she worked with the other Deputy Commissioner and kind of came up with these 7 foundational principles. She worked later with some teams from the Netherlands to formalize this, and they published this paper in 2009, laying out these 7 principles that kind of guide how you do privacy by design. And one of the quotes from this is, "Privacy by design advances the view that the future of privacy cannot be assured solely by compliance with regulatory frameworks. Rather, privacy assurance must ideally become an organization's default mode of operation." So the important thing here is we have these privacy principles, but privacy by design is the concept of how we take that and actually do it. So these are the 7 principles, and I don't know if they're going to hand out the slides, but I did make it a link so that you could go read them if you want. It's very short, a couple of pages, and talk through these things. So getting ahead of it, proactive versus reactive, much easier to fix something or take care of something in advance than fix it later. You sometimes get tunnel vision when you're trying to fix it, and you're really only reacting to that problem instead of looking at it with a more holistic view. Privacy is the default setting. The best illustration for me is that I don't want a user to inadvertently make something public that they didn't mean to. So starting it off as private by default and then letting them make the choice, always better. Privacy embedded into design. This is, again, building it into those processes. And you'll see these themes through the things I talk about, but I did want to go through them quickly. Number 4, the way it's worded is not exactly clear, but basically it's the notion of making it a win-win situation. Achieve the goals for everybody in a way that's friendly and respects everyone's rights. Don't make trade-offs with things to lessen the experience. End to end, beginning to end. Look at privacy through the whole life cycle. Visibility and transparency. Give people information. Help them understand, be open with it so that they can make informed choices. And then keep it user-centric. This is all about humans. We can't forget that. It's their data. Think about their experiences, what they need, what they want. I should use this, actually. So since then, these are kind of high-level theoretical principles. Even the paper doesn't go into a lot of detail on all of them, maybe a paragraph for each. So since then, people have talked about it, and NISA has issued some reports, which you can read later if you're interested. I think the ISO used these to kind of inform some of the standards. But then GDPR really enshrined this in law. This is all kind of, oh, this is the things we should do, but here it's like, okay, now you have to. It's in the law. And one thing I'll mention is I think that privacy and data protection are also often used as interchangeable terms. They don't quite mean the same thing, but I think colloquially people use them the same way. Privacy is really, for example, what former Supreme Court Justice Brandeis wrote about in 1890, the right to be let alone. So this is the notion of your life being private, your information being private until you choose to share it. Data protection actually marries privacy and security. That's how I look at it. Privacy is being responsible with the data, and then security is protecting it. So data protection, that's how I view it. So really, GDPR, doing data protection by design and by default, is probably the better phrase for it because it does heavily tie into security. So I put the actual text from these 2 portions of Article 25 from the GDPR to kind of illustrate this. This one is more about data protection by design. They kind of go together, so you can't really separate them. But the first thing I want to point out is that it says implement appropriate technical and organizational measures. That's really important, appropriate. What's appropriate for one type of data might not be appropriate for another or adequate. but it's designed to implement the principles. So that's where we go from these principles of data minimization, notice and choice, and things like that, and actually put these into action. Do something to make sure that's implemented, and to integrate the safeguards that you need to protect the data. And this is when you're designing things. And so by default, again, with the appropriate technical and organizational measures that by default only process data that's necessary, which I would argue is still part of the first part because the necessity principle, but still. And by default, it's not made accessible without their intervention if they don't want it to be. So, and that's very important, considering the user's expectation. So that's kind of the high-level academic on-paper portion of it. So what does that mean? I'm very much a person who learns best with examples and illustrations, visual kind of thing. I regret that I don't have a goat, unfortunately. I love that picture. It was just great for some reason. But I did try to make it at least illustrative, exemplary. So I want to talk about privacy by design from the perspective of what we've done with our program at Garmin. Can't distill the whole program into 20 minutes, of course, but I will talk about some of the core tenets of our approach, and I'll talk about some other kind of words of wisdom from what we've done. So one of the things I want to talk about first is that we've taken a risk-based approach, and this is what the GDPR is built around, is a risk-based approach. And what that doesn't mean, oh, well, maybe I won't get in trouble for that. What it means is you look at what's appropriate. They use that word through the whole law. Appropriate, adequate, what makes sense for that situation. So you want to make sure that you look at what you're doing and you say, okay, for this, I need more security than I would for something else. The example I like to use in my training is if I have a list on my desk of first names and t-shirt sizes. If somebody takes that, I don't need to lock that in a wall safe with like 4 combinations or something. But if I have a bunch of medical records or payroll data or something, that is much more sensitive. And so what's appropriate for that would not be the same thing. If I have to put in my fingerprint and things like that to get a list of t-shirt sizes, that's overkill. You don't want to overburden the business, and you don't want to overburden the user. Oh, sorry. So the second part is global first. So GDPR is probably one of the most famous or infamous laws on data protection, but it's not the only one. As an international company, we have users around the world. And so we are not just beholden to GDPR. We have all these other laws to comply with. And just from a very practical standpoint, having one rule for everything makes a lot more sense. It's easier to follow. It's less error-prone. It's less confusing for the user. And it ensures that we're meeting the obligations of respecting people's rights. And so maybe they get more than they would necessarily under their local laws, but whatever. The best example of this is our account management center. In the lead up to GDPR, we spent a lot of time and resources building that to allow all users to go look at their data, export it, delete it, play with it, whatever they wanted to do, fix it, and on their own time, at their own convenience. And we gave that to everybody, not just those in Europe. Because it's an added value. Everybody wants to look at their data, and it's all about their choice. And so this was win-win, because for us it was easy, and for the user it was great. And so just like Dr. Kavukian said, make it a win-win situation. So, and single point of failure is actually what I meant to mention there, is from the software days, is if you have 4 processes and you have to figure out which one, that's a really easy way for something to go wrong. So with the customer focus, again, don't forget about the humans. That's the whole reason that data protection exists, right? To protect the rights of the data subjects. So we don't want to make things confusing for them, or make it a poor experience, just to tick some regulatory box. We want to take what the actual intention is there and implement that in a way that works for the user as well. The last one is transparency. And so this one is, I don't mean just German versus English, but the same language. Engineer Becky and legal Becky speak very different languages. I could say a word to someone, and it might mean one thing to me and another from them, because our experiences, our background, our education, where we grew up, all of our societal norms and culture all color your understanding and the way you interpret something. And so it's very difficult to communicate, especially cross-culturally and things like that. So, and then you throw language into it, and it's a whole other issue. So making sure that you're being transparent, that you're communicating things clearly and openly, somebody understands what you're doing, which again is very difficult. You know, I have been at Garmin for 14.5 years now, and so my perception of anything is colored by some background information that somebody else might not have. When I was a functional tester, I used to say I would like to take the device and the quick start guide and hand it to my mom or somebody else and say, here, can you follow this? Does it make sense? Because that's going to be a better kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Benchmark as to whether it's actually understandable. And the favorite example I have, and it makes me laugh every time, which is why I share it, is when you're using terms of art, when I'm talking to you guys about privacy or security, because as people in privacy, you probably also are interested in security. If I say certain security terms, you know what they mean. For example, if I talk about a bad actor, everybody knows that's like a hacker or something. If I hand that to some random person who knows nothing about security and ask them to translate it, I'm going to get Einschlechter, Schauspieler. Not exactly what we mean. Really funny, though. But you have to make sure that you're actually conveying the meaning that you intend. So some other things, which that didn't work. It was supposed to just do them one by one. Some other things that have helped us. I'm really proud of the work we've done. I can't distill it all down, but we really have tried very hard to give users a good experience that also gives them choice, gives them the control. And here are some of the reasons that I think it's been successful is upper management buy-in, the leadership. No matter what your organization is, there's some leadership. Make them understand why privacy is important and communicate that. It does wonders for engagement. If I say it, oh yeah, that's Becky, she's just the DPO, if she has to say that. But if upper management, if our CEO, somebody says privacy is important and this is something we should work on and invest in, really gets people helping you out a lot more. Process integration, like I said, don't leave all those points of failure. If you have a design process, some sort of product life cycle where you're designing things, build privacy right into that, even if it's just the flag to go do these other things. Because if it's a separate thing that somebody has to remember to trigger on their own, I can tell you it's not going to happen, unfortunately. It's human nature. And then internal engagement. As much as I would like to take credit for this, I cannot at all. We have so many people helping us. And I'm not so arrogant to think that I'm an expert in everything and know what a marine user versus a fitness user would expect, what's the norm for those things. I rely heavily on allies and subject matter experts within the business to help, to make sure that we're giving that experience and giving the controls that would be expected or the configurations or, yes, they would absolutely expect for you to do this, and doing those things. I can't know that. So having them there, it's a team effort. If it was just me, we'd be nowhere, just one person and just with one frame of reference. That's really, really valuable, is to get those other opinions, the expertise to come together and make it work. Oh, look, now it's going to do it. How exciting. So some questions that you could ask yourself are listed here, and I won't read them to you, but think about things. What would a user expect? If you made a weather app, and that's all it does is check for the weather where you are, would they really expect Fort Knox security sitting there, fingerprint, PIN number, maybe retinal scan? They're not. That's not appropriate for the situation. What would they expect there? And what are others doing? This type of app, a user has a perception of what those are. Does this fit in with that? Maybe you're deviating. Of course, maybe it's for a good reason, and that's fine, but you should consider what's standard in the industry, especially with security, the state-of-the-art portion, very important. Security is constantly evolving. And what a cyclist wants versus what a ship captain wants, two completely different things. Really consider those experiences. And what's necessary, what controls should be there, all of these are things to think about. So I'll run through a few just real-world examples of things we've done quickly. So with Garmin Connect, this is our online platform where you can upload data, look at it, pretty graphs, and track things, and compete with people. There's challenges and stuff. So you do not have to upload data. Your watch will show you all the data on there. There are some value-add things on Connect where your watch just doesn't have the horsepower it needs to. We need some servers to crunch on it. It's a lot of stuff. But you don't have to. You can do everything with your watch except for online features, obviously. You'd think I wouldn't have to say that, but I do. No, I cannot give you that online feature without data. So we're not in the data business. We're in the consumer electronic business. We provide these things as a value add to our customers. And so uploaded data, if you do choose to upload it, which you have to actively choose to upload it, it's private by default. Unless you go change that, nobody else is going to see it. So we allow the user to make that choice. We also have APIs where third parties like Strava or MyFitnessPal can integrate. And when they do that, still, even if you have an account there, you have to go take an action within Garmin to enable that link. And then you can sever it on the Garmin side as well. And then it doesn't work at all. You don't have to go and do things everywhere. We make it very, very easy for that. Privacy policies. Before GDPR, kind of the new BCAD, I think, for privacy professionals. I read about a study that Carnegie Mellon did where they looked at privacy policies from 7 common sites and deduced that there were like around 2,500 average words in those, and that it would take about 10 minutes to read each one. And then they said the average internet user encounters like over 1,000 websites or something in a month, which I thought was maybe so, but they said it would take 25 days a year to just read privacy policies for all these sites. Unfortunately, the law does have a lot of obligations of information that you have to give to the user and make available. You and I both know not everybody reads them, so we've taken a layered approach. We try to put very high-level information. You can see kind of a very high-level, bite-sized, 2-sentence thing. You can get into a little more with a little more detail, and we try to really put the highlights there, the things we know most people really, really want to hear without having to slog through a privacy policy. If you want to go through the privacy policy, you can click. It's all there. You can look at it. It's lovely. I wrote it, some of them. And so you can get to that information, but you don't have to go through all of that if really you just wanted these high-level nuggets. But there is a lot of stuff we have to put in there, so they do get kind of lengthy. We have ours broken down kind of by service category almost to make it easy to find what you're looking for, what Garmin products you use. These friendly, nice little nugget policies, I don't even write those. I give it to somebody who writes for humans, so it doesn't sound like an engineer or a lawyer wrote it. It's them. We make sure it has the information it needs and conveys the meaning, but that is written not by anyone in legal. Full policy, while it is written by me or someone else in the legal or privacy team, we actually still have marketing review them and say, hey, you understand this? And proof it and make some suggestions. So we really do try to make those understandable. And this is where speaking the same language comes in, because localization is just another real fun thing to have to deal with. Privacy zones. This is a feature that we have where some people do really like to share their runs and their cycle trips and everything. But a lot of your runs or something might start at your house or your work or your child's school or something like that. And so you will still see your full route, but if you configure a privacy zone and you can change the size of it, maybe if you live in a very urban area, it doesn't need to be as big. If you live somewhere that's a little more spread out, maybe it's bigger, you will still see your full route, but others will see a modified route where when it deviates through that privacy zone, we kind of obscure that. So it helps people to be able to share, but only be able to share enough to where it's not really going to reveal more than they want. And the last one I'll mention is, I mentioned earlier, we have API integrations where a Garmin Connect user can integrate or link their account with a third-party platform, whoever that may be. But we also offer software development kits. We have a group within Garmin called Garmin Health. They actually work a lot with partners like Strava or something, but also researchers, hospitals, or what's the other, insurance companies or something who are doing things with wearables. And we do offer a software development kit where you can build your own app, service, whatever, that can talk directly to the device so that you don't have to go through Garmin to upload the data to us just for us to toss it back to you. It is that direct path, and then you keep it right there. Especially, this can be very important, research or something like that, where it's very sensitive data, you want to keep it local, there is an option for that. So we did build something for that. So thanks. I hope that was informative and interesting, and I'm sure you have some follow-up questions, but I really appreciate everybody's time and attention and for inviting me here today. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Becky. This has been tremendously informative for me, too.
Got the hard questions now, huh?
Person that doesn't actually wear wearables. But I'm thinking about it now, actually, after this afternoon, or we're in the middle of it. Now, you mentioned this, I'm addressing the legal Becky now, so to speak. Okay. You mentioned that very well-known legal text, the first privacy law by Louis Brandeis, 1890. The right to be left alone, I think co-written with Samuel Warren, who was his elder at that time, I think, and more powerful than young Brandeis was before.
Well, they were both law students at the time at Harvard Law.
They were both law students.
Yeah, they both wrote this as a law review article, which is just kind of this internal legal research thing. And then he later went on to become a Supreme Court justice, and he cited his own article, which is kind of funny, in a dissenting opinion in a very big privacy case in the U.S.
I read in a philosopher's book by Raymond Goyce, who was teaching at Harvard, I think. No, Cambridge it was, right? Forgot about it. Who wrote about that first text, and he said the reason that those two guys actually opted for the first privacy law was that the wife of Samuel Warren, who was a very important society lady, held those parties. And those parties were always reported on by paparazzi, we will call them today. We had a similar case here in Germany just a couple of years later when there were photos taken by the dead Bismarck that led actually to privacy rules. So now today we could actually think of the opposite, that people would stage parties and ask the press to actually come and report on those parties. What I'm getting at is just notions of privacy are always prone to change, right? They change or can change very fast through time. And now I would like to ask you the very concrete question. You talked about this privacy zone on your devices. Is this something that is written in there by default, or do people actually have to set it up, their own privacy zone? Or is there a privacy zone to begin with before you do your run, or your cycle run, or your
well, you do have to set it up because we don't know where you live, or those places that are private to you. So you do have to actually go and set it up. Like I said, of course, your data is not available to anybody else unless you choose to share it. But yeah, we have to know what you consider to be a privacy zone.
Do many people do that, actually? Do many people opt for that?
Yeah, I think they do. Yeah, especially around places like their home. Maybe not. It kind of depends. Like I said, in an urban area, I don't know that people would use that as much because it's still hard to divine. There's 15 buildings with 100 apartments each, whatever. But yeah, they do use it. And there was a big story a while back about, and again, this is with one of the reasons why things are private by default, is there was someone whose wearable was broadcasting where they were, and they were on a secret military base.
Oh, wow.
And so, I mean, these are, again, if you want to share your data, whatever, but maybe he should put a privacy zone around it. This was not Garmin, by the way. It's not visible on Garmin, another company. But this is why it's important to make sure that they're making the choice to share the data. And then when they're in full control, all those privacy settings there, you can see all the stuff that you can change and that you can configure.
How about managing consumer consent? I mean, you can consent to a company that produces wearables that your data can be shared with third parties, right? That's something you have to actively say yes to. That's right?
I mean, yes. Not at Garmin. We don't do that. We don't sell data. We share. I mean, if there's a service that a third party provides to us, and we have to give them the data to do that, like facilitating, sending marketing communications, there's services and stuff. But we don't sell data. We don't just randomly share data. The third-party scenario is where we ask for consent is with these API connections, but we don't just share data with, here, Strava or whoever have some have some data, we don't do that. So we don't have a consent for that because we don't do it. We share it with service providers and then whoever is needed to fulfill what you've asked to do.
Well, not personal data, but do you think that people's attitude towards privacy actually has changed in the last couple of decades since we interact so much more with technology that they are maybe, I keep saying that, I know, care less, because what we've seen after the Snowden revelation was one thing that many people are really indifferent.
Well, it's fatigue. I can't tell you how annoyed I am every time I see a cookie banner. It has all these toggles, and I'm like, God, I just wanted to look at the news article or website or whatever it was, and it's a lot of it is fatigue, and also just kind of societal fatigue. We have to care about a lot of things right now, and so it's very exhausting, and I think that wears people down a little bit. I do think that attitudes on what people consider very private and sensitive have changed as well, like you talked about. I mean, the rise of influencers. Everybody wants everything on Instagram and Facebook for the internet points. You know, I do think there is a changed notion there. And then I think there's also the group that just kind of distrusts everything now and just wants to go hide in a cave because it's all very overwhelming. They're never sure what's going on with the data. You hear about a data breach every day, and all of that is bound to change how people look at things. That is one thing I struggle with a little bit is, you know, I do, and this is not meant to be an advertisement for Garmin, but, you know, one of the things I like working about Garmin is I feel like we are a responsible company. We don't sell data, but it's really hard to convince people that we don't do stuff like that, or that their device that's a personal navigation device in their vehicle that I can't see where they are. I mean, it's a GPS receiver, not transmitter, but you know, I can't convince people that we don't do that because they're so used to everyone kind of doing all these crazy things, and they see it in the news on these horrible headlines. It does make it very difficult to really communicate openly with the consumer because they're like, oh, I don't trust you. You're saying you don't do this? That really makes it difficult. Yeah. So it's what do you do in that situation?
So people don't believe you, I think.
You can, you know, but it's definitely changing attitudes, kind of changing you know, the kind of status quo that they believe everything is at, and that makes the conversation very different.
Sometimes I'm thinking part of the reason for that may be that there's just many people using those devices who have never heard about the GDPR, who would not know what that term would be in German. Datenschutzgrundverordnung, that's... Yeah, but who can actually spell that out? If you do a street survey and ask people using wearables, you know what that is? Datenschutzgrundverordnung
I tell you,
or
the
GDPR?
emails I get beg to differ.
Really?
Oh, I get a lot of emails from people who are certain what the rights mean that are kind of, people have definitely heard of it, for sure. And we do get, you know, things even from other countries where they know that we operate in Europe too, so they're just like, oh, I want to assert these rights under GDPR. You know, with this kind of service, I don't just go look at whatever data you upload. Often I might not even know where you are. If you travel a lot, God, you could be anywhere. I don't need your mailing address or anything. You know, to me, you are someone who stores their data to look at in graphs. You know, unless you've purchased something, a subscription, I might not even really know where you are. Again, the reason for the one rule and kind of servicing everything the same way. But I definitely get a lot of emails with people spouting off stuff from the GDPR. They've heard of it. They may not understand it, but they've heard of it.
Let's look at Slido. What does Slido say, or certain users at Slido say? Can you summarize a little bit, please?
We actually have a question about the privacy by default principle that you mentioned. So there are data processes or data collection that is allowed by this legitimate interest. Does this automatically cancel out the privacy by default principle, or can those two both coexist?
I think they can coexist depending on what you're trying to base legitimate interests. You know, it would be difficult to justify selling data on legitimate interests. But for example, if you're talking about the use of aggregated data or something to make sure things are working right as a legitimate interest, I don't think that undermines the privacy by default, because the whole point of privacy by default is making the default state respect the principles. And you know, this is actually part of For my analytics example is part of how you make sure things are running right, provide security, detect anomalies, and stop bad stuff from happening. But a big part of that is to not distribute information to this public sphere or whatever without the user's intervention. That's really the important piece of it, not never using the data, but trying to keep to those principles, and when you do, I think it's still, those two can definitely coexist. Just depends on the situation. It's the lawyer answer, it depends. Always it depends.
Another one from Slido, or should we switch to?
So we have one that is quite interesting, if we have the time. So there's a question how the data processing of the future might look like. Is there a trend towards more processing on the cloud side, or is it also possible to do more on the device itself so that my data or the user's data would not even be transmitted to a server?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, I think a lot of people are moving to the cloud. There are a lot of benefits that can provide, especially for smaller organizations or, gosh, I'm tangled, and things like that, because then they can have the co-location, the redundancy to keep things going. They have a lot more processing power and things like that. I do think that, again, I think it depends on the situation. People are so used to using kind of their phone and apps for everything that I do think that the focus isn't as much as putting things on the device, but I do think it depends probably on the segment. I mean, in our marine segment, for example, everything it has to kind of be on the device because they're out in the middle of the water somewhere, but someone who's running or whatever, they might not be as away from signal. So I think there is that kind of default assumption that you're always going to have an internet connection to be able to make use of those things. It is a lot easier to fix a problem or make an improvement on the server side rather than trying to, hey, don't forget to update your firmware, don't forget to update the software. It's really hard to get people to update. It's a pain. They're like, I'll do that later. So there are a lot of benefits there that it does provide. And so I do think we'll see more of a trend to the cloud situation, but I don't know. All the security laws that are coming online and things like that could change that.
Any questions from the floor, so to speak? There's two in the back. Please.
Yeah, thank you. It was brilliant to see how you implement privacy by design, which I was also propagating since 2010. And it's great to see that it went into the data protection regulation. But I was wondering, let me enhance your data protection definition, because privacy is one fundamental right, and the data protection regulation also focuses on more fundamental rights than only privacy is, and that's sometimes challenging to think and how to implement this in practices and to do data protection by design in this
yes.
In this
I did not mean to indicate that any of this is easy, by the way.
Yeah, of course.
At all, it's definitely not.
And I was wondering how you, if you also take this into account. Like, for instance, we spoke about autonomy or for instance freedom of speech. These are also rights which might be affected by devices which steer me, which are based on models of certain persona which I do not fit, for instance. Are you working on this topic?
So that is very, you guys are asking the hard questions. Data protection overlaps with a lot of things. I know, again, we're talking about wearables today, but just in my day-to-day job, something that I look at might overlap with employment law or any number of other things. And so it's never in a vacuum by itself. You always have to consider all of these scenarios. The freedom of speech thing, thankfully, we are not Facebook, so that is not as much of a concern for us. All the laws about regulating hate speech and things like that, generally speaking, our platforms are sharing data. There's some limited ability for things like that. So it's not something that I'm particularly working a lot on because it's not something that comes up, that particular example. But we are constantly looking at data protection as just one piece of everything. Looking at security, looking at other regulatory frameworks, telecommunications laws for our devices that can actually communicate with satellites or whatever, all of those things. And you have to look at it all together. You can't just look at one thing. And sometimes that's very, very challenging because you need to do this thing to kind of satisfy the intent over here, but maybe the GDPR has exceptions for legal obligation, or has a lawful basis of a legal obligation, but if it's not EU law, it doesn't count. And so you have to think about how you look at that. Well, we still need to comply with the law over here, and work together on those things, and it's pretty difficult. I don't actually have real good tips on that other than, read a lot and just try to brainstorm with all of those subject matter experts that I talk about to try to consider all the different viewpoints of it, because it's a difficult problem.
Okay, we got one last question. Neil, please, before we all have to take a break. Tell you right in a minute how long it's going to be, right, Elizabeth?
So,
please.
Yeah, thanks very, very much. This is, again, a question which perhaps is focusing more on your experience and what advice you might give. Having been in a situation before where one has to attempt to persuade, you mentioned management buy-in, you had to persuade management about the importance of certain ethical considerations, privacy in this case, obviously I'm counting as one of those. In your experience, what works best to motivate that kind of buy-in? Is it best to do so through the implementation of legal measures that sort of is the cudgel at the end of the day that one can use to try and compel, adherence? Or can you actually instill those as values that they consider to be important beyond just things that they're obligated to do by law? What would you suggest going forward? Since a big part of success here is, exactly as you say, management buy-in.
You have to cultivate a culture that has this kind of common goal and vision of what things would be like. One of our common things is this is the customer's data, right? We need to give them choices. We need to help them understand what's happening there, help them be able to make configurations to protect it however they want or use it however they want. And I'm not a huge fan of just saying the law says so. As a former engineer, I like to know why. I never like to just accept things. So the approach I take is I explain the why behind it, and I try not to have that be exclusively legal, because to be quite honest with you, the response is, well, that's stupid. I didn't make the law, I'm the messenger. So I do talk about the law, but I also talk about the customer experience and impact, what it means, what it looks like for us, all of those things. I think you really have to have the message be very well-rounded and cover all of those things so that you get something that resonates with that particular person or with your vision for how you do business and your kind of corporate persona, for lack of a better word, what you want to present out there. If you just, you can scare people with, oh my God, did you see that huge $80 million fine or whatever that was imposed on so-and-so? That works a little bit, but if you really get them to care about the reasons behind it, you'll get a lot more engagement there. Yeah.
So basically what you're doing with management at Garmin is what IniviDas is trying to do with the broader public, right? Is actually raise consciousness, increase consciousness about those topics we've been talking about now since 1:30. Thank you so much. Yeah. Becky, we'll see us at the closing discussion. Okay. Becky Caldwell. Now we're going to take a break.
Thank you.
Fine.